Welcome to Buckets, brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. My name's Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, joined by the one, the only Jim Turvey. You can find him in the Action Network app and on Twitter at TurveyBets, where he has killed the NBA and WNBA slate all year long. WNBA keeps rolling along. As you want to get set for Commissioner's Cup and get picks for that, make sure that you check out all of Jim's coverage and his picks in the Action Network app. We are, when did the WNBA playoffs start, Jim?
Not too long from now. It's a kind of late September, so we're about a month out. We're about the 3/4 of the way through a season. Got a nice little mini break for most of the teams, while the Aces Liberty kind of get us started in what hopefully is the first of many meetings in the next couple months here.
Yeah, unless there is an upset, make sure to check out both Jim's content in the Action Network app, and of course on this feed, you can check out the WNBA feed, as they are calling it Wuckets, which I love. That's just phenomenal. But that is not the topic of today's show, Jim. No. This is a Philadelphia 76ers shit show episode. So I wouldn't necessarily call this an emergency episode. Harden, here's the whole timeline. Last Friday, I believe, Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN reports that the Sixers have effectively pulled James Harden from trade talks. I don't know what that means because they were only talking to one team, but sure, they pulled him from trade talks, and their intention is to go into training camp with the hope that Harden will join the team and they'll play and try and figure out a solution later on. Harden, who's in China on an Adidas trip, enjoying that good Chinese money, he goes and he makes this comment to everyone at this little camp, including a bunch of kids that were very confused. Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be part of an organization he is a part of. Let me say this again, he said. Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be part of an organization that he's a part of. Not really mincing words, not really disguising his intentions there. And like Woj follows this up with reporting on Monday that Harden has every intention of making this as uncomfortable as possible for the Sixers. So, Jim, I want to get your reaction to it, and then I'll try and provide a little bit of like the big picture NBA politics of this and how this is actually going. Well, what's been your reaction to all of this nonsense between Harden and the Sixers?
Well, I think the first thing, my first reaction was that word that you said right there is kind of nonsense. That was what it was, to be honest. I mean, you watch that video, it's high comedy, to be honest. It's the unintentional comedy levels that just, you knew what was going to happen online. You knew what Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, was going to do with it. To be honest, it's also not all that surprising. We've seen this time and time again, and this isn't even just on her. We just see these relationships break down often in the NBA. I think, it's a league that has, I think, for the better, it prioritized, players being able to take control of their own actions, but there are downsides to it too. And sometimes you see players maybe take things to the extremes, and Harden is probably the leader in the clubhouse of taking that to the extreme. So to be honest, when I look at it from a pure basketball perspective, it almost was one of those, I wouldn't say in one ear out the other. It's obviously a huge piece of news, but I immediately started thinking on a betting level of how can we approach this. We'll be getting to that later, but I didn't get too hung up in the weeds of like who said what, who can call who what, who's accountable, because I think we're kind of on the same page here. It was a little bit nonsensical, to be honest.
Yeah, I think the question kind of is, for bettors, does how this is going or how this happened, does it matter? Probably not. Probably not. Like, look, the odds of James Harden ever playing in a Sixers uniform again are very, very low. They're almost non-existent to zero. If Simmons wasn't going to play, Harden's not going to play because Harden's got more leverage than Simmons had. There are other ramifications, which we'll talk about in a second. I will try and do the very abbreviated, to make a long story short, too late kind of summation of this. Harden feels that he had a deal with Morey. He took less last summer, took that deal, was going into free agency this summer and would get paid a max contract, a superstar max contract. In the meantime, starting at Christmas, and I had heard about it in November, like the word was out that Harden wanted to go back to Houston, and Houston was interested in a reunion, and it was like, hey, it sounds like it's very likely that Harden's going to be gone. That was not coming from Houston's side. That was coming from Houston saying, Harden sounds like he wants to come back. And so what Harden effectively did here is he had the backup plan of Philly. Well, if all else goes wrong, at least I'll get the max money from Philly. But I will probably, become a free agent and I'll re-sign with Houston and go back home and all this. The Rockets hire Ime Udoka, and immediately you start to hear like a shift in the conversation, which is like, yeah, the Rockets are. It might be a thing. They're still interested, but they're going to see what's out there. And the other thing you started to hear was like, hey, the Rockets are very interested in Fred VanVleet. And as we got closer and closer to free agency, the noise about VanVleet went up and the noise about Harden went down. That's why you started to hear all the talk about like, Harden may just re-sign with Philly. That's Harden's people being like, uh-oh, the musical chairs may have stopped here. The music may have stopped. Go Philly. Yay, Sixers. Go Sixers, go. And then Morey predictably is like, well, hang on, like you've been trying to go elsewhere. Like our deal was contingent upon certain agreements, and now you're leveraging me against this other team. And somewhere in there is where the disconnect happened, and now you've resulted in this. There's also the idea of like Harden opted in, and that Harden opted in with the understanding they would try and trade him. There's probably a difference between Harden agreeing to opt in with the agreement that they'll try and trade him, and Harden opting in and demanding to go to one team that doesn't have any assets that they can send Daryl Morey, who is still trying to contend with Joel Embiid. So at the end of this, who do I blame? Look, in my experience, there are a lot of things you can say about Daryl Morey. Being untruthful is not necessarily one of them. Morey has been upfront, painfully so. There was a situation a couple years ago where a player was very worried about being traded. He was a member of the Rockets, and he was very worried about getting traded. He loved Houston, and he loved playing there. And he goes to Daryl Morey, and he's like, "Hey, I'm really worried about getting traded, man. Like, are we going to get a new contract? Like, I just want to stay. Like, I don't want to get traded, Daryl." And Daryl said, "I know." Like, that's how it goes. Because Daryl's always going to be like, he's going to take the emotion out of it, right? And so at the end of this is Harden pretty clearly feels like he's entitled to whatever he wants. And Morey is always going to gravitate towards what is the most logical outcome for his benefit and that of the team. So I don't expect Harden to ever play for the Sixers again. I think that's over. Before we get to the betting stuff, and I know you got some good stuff there, but I do want to get like the background on this so we understand the severity of the situation. 2 weeks ago, we have Joel Embiid on a panel appearance with Uninterrupted saying, I want to win a championship, whether that's in Philly or somewhere else. That's shot one across the bow. Now today is Joel has removed Philadelphia and the process from all of his social media handles. Now, look, I personally don't put a lot of stock in that stuff. A number of people have access to these players' social media accounts. They have teams of people that manage them with them. They can tweet if they want. They can DM friends with as much as they want on there, but there are other people that have access to the account. So there's any number of reasons why he could have done this, right? But it's notable that as essentially the Harden situation is imploding and Harden is promising to make things uncomfortable as he warms up the fat suit for training camp, then on the other side of this, Joel is doing the opposite of being like, I hope we can get James back. Like, I just want to win a championship. But if James isn't back, I feel confident in our guys. We've got Tyrese Maxey. Tobias Harris is my guy. Like, that's what you would like to hear, even if it's just complete lip service. You would like to hear that. Instead, you have this. I will tell you, and I've said this on You Better You Bet on my radio appearances. I have hinted at it in columns. I have written about it. I've talked about it on this podcast. I have a bet on the New York Knicks now to win the NBA title. And the reason I have a bet on the New York Knicks to win the NBA title is because if Joel Embiid gets traded, I think he goes to New York. And that's enough to justify the value on the Knicks in the market at just absolutely pretty predictably ridiculous numbers, 55-1 over at FanDuel. I will ask you before we get to your betting angles, do you have how much is the Embiid part of this factoring into your betting analysis?
Not a whole lot. I think for a couple of reasons. I am the resident Joel Embiid supporter, and ironically, I'm not. I like Joel Embiid. It's more that I feel the need to stand up for him at times when I think you and Brandon are particularly hard on him. And in my mind, this season was always going to be kind of a last stand type season for Embiid in my mind, to be honest, because I am of the mind that he has been selling himself out for this MVP to win the MVP the last couple of seasons, and that it really has hurt him when it comes to the postseason. And I am the resident Embiid, backer, so take it with the grain of salt that you will. But I do think that before all of this came out, before all of the Harden stuff, before the Embiid comments, a couple of weeks ago, I was seeing this as the season that he was going to treat the regular season as a warm up for the postseason and finally be ready for the postseason in actuality. Now, I don't know how this changes that, because that to me is the most interesting part of this. With Harden around, that's a little bit more feasible. Harden can kind of carry the team if Embiid misses some time. If Harden's out of town, I love Tyrese Maxey. I think it's actually a decent team that can float to a certain extent, just below 500 without those two guys. But it certainly is not the same level of being able to take a week off to rest up, because you see the big picture here if James is out of town. So I don't want to be the person. I am not the person who's going to be making excuses for Embiid anymore. So if Harden is out of town and he does want to treat the regular season as a warm up for the postseason, he's going to have to find a way to make sure that they get there, because I think that is a legitimate question. If Harden is out of town and Embiid is not maybe going as hard in the regular season, which I think in general is actually probably a good thing, because we really need to see him at full strength in the postseason. But making those two things work, when you and I both think that Harden is probably done in Philadelphia, it suddenly is getting a lot more difficult to imagine.
So we'll talk. I've already, I've given the speech about the Knicks situation. I've talked about that. From a Sixers position, let's just talk about the market and where it's at, and then what I've got for them. So Sixers win total right now at FanDuel is 49.5 still. It is even at minus 110 on both sides. So right away we've got that. They are minus 1,500 to make the playoffs. No is plus 790, which I was not aware of until this podcast. I will probably be looking at that. We'll talk about that in a second. Sixers are 17-1 to win the NBA title. Embiid is 700 to win, 7-1 to win a back-to-back MVP. Tyrese Maxey is 15-1 to win Most Improved Player. The Sixers are plus 650 to win their division. And I'm sorry, that's a conference. 650 to win the conference, and division is plus 270. So that's a look at the market there.
Well, Matt, before we go on too much further, there's one name that we still haven't touched on at all, and I want to hear the latest on this from you. I mean, I'm guessing if we haven't heard it, it's because there is no latest, but that name is Dame.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious about the timing of all this stuff, because I have talked about this before. Dame and Embiid have a good relationship. They're friends. And there was a lot of buzz about the possibility of Dame playing with Embiid at some point. And the idea was hey, Dame might get traded this summer, and he might get traded to the Sixers, and he would go and replace Harden. And the fact that both those guys are still on the market, I just kind of wind up being doesn't that make the most sense out of all these possibilities? But with Embiid not being for sure in Philly, that explains a little bit of that dynamic as well. There's nothing new, and the Miami reports have been the Heat are frustrated because the Blazers won't engage on talks. And the Blazer side of that is, what is there to talk about? You don't suddenly have a great prospect. If you suddenly had Tyrese Maxey, we'd have that conversation. But we're not interested in Tyler Hero. You got to find a third team, and even then, we're not super excited about it. Even if you do that, there's nothing to talk about right now. And so that's kind of where the Blazers are at in this whole thing. I am very curious about like unforeseen consequences of what happens if the Harden situation implodes, Embiid is the next to want out. Like if you're, and this is getting wildly speculative, I want to be very clear on this. This is not reporting. I am not reporting this. This is an entirely speculative comment from me. But if you're the Heat and Dame says, like, I want to go there, you should trade Bam and whatever for Embiid. Embiid gets to play with Jimmy, who he loves. Bam going on the market would probably open up a lot of things in terms of what assets would go wherever. If you can reply to this with like a million, why would X team do this? I get it. I am not suggesting it. What I am telling you is that it is very interesting to me that James Harden is having this situation. Dame is not going to be a trailblazer by the end of the year, and there is a pre-existing relationship between Damian Lillard and Joel Embiid. That at least has me like, like it's interesting. The most likely scenario is that Embiid finishes in Philly this season, and then we'll see what happens. Dame goes to Miami. We can talk about that when that happens. And Harden winds up, who God knows where, right? So that's like the most likely outcome. But I am interested in the moving pieces of this. At 49.5 on the win total, I've got them, after subtracting Harden, I still have them at 51 wins based off of power rating.
And do you do that player based? And do you have like a number of games played for Embiid there?
Right. So that would be based off of the same number for Embiid as last season.
Yeah.
If he plays less, that's probably ticking us down to about 49.5. And so we're right at the number. That's also based off of, now one of the interesting questions kind of here is if we're looking at this and I'm trying to evaluate like how much to take off. I took off about a point from their power rating on Harden. That feels light, but a lot of this is like Harden was worth last season. I have an article coming out with top 100. I'm not going to bore everybody with the numbers, but it is kind of interesting. I used a metric to take expected wins added and actually translate it into a objective spread value. Okay.
Oh, cool.
Like, this is not what the books would use, but this is like an objective value based off of expected wins added, which is a cousin of EPM, which we like so much at Dunks and Threes. Harden's worth about 4 points to the spread, and you go like, okay, if you subtract the 4 from their thing last year, clearly it's more. Well, that's in a vacuum. That's if there's no replacement value. You have to take Maxey and then extrapolate him to per 36 minutes, and what you wind up coming to there is about 1.5 points. Niang is probably worth about 1/4 of a point to 1/2 a point. So now we're looking at like, okay, and Shake Milton and Niang are probably worth 1/2 point. Now you're looking at closer to like maybe 2. So maybe I'm still too high on them based off of like, I very genuinely was kind of like, I don't know, how important is Harden? Like, I don't know how important Harden is. The number is probably somewhere between 49 and 51. I don't know that necessarily, like, that doesn't make me excited to bet an over here. I think on a win total basis, if we look at it through this prism of just losing Harden and getting nothing back, then in that situation, I still wouldn't like it. I would probably like an over if they were to pull off a pretty good trade for Harden, but I don't imagine that happening. Do you have thoughts on like the win total specifically and how to play that?
Yeah, the win total to me is the toughest one because you got to kind of harness the I don't know. You got to kind of lean into it right now because there are so many missing pieces of the puzzle, or maybe the pieces of the puzzle are there, but we don't know. They have it. They're flipped upside down, and we can't even see if it's the right piece of the puzzle right now because there's so many different ways this could play out in the next couple months. So to me, I actually would lean just because I think this team is so highly variant, and we'll get to that in other markets. If anything, I would probably lean towards an under in it. But again, to me, the win total is just a little too nerve wracking to put myself on either side of right now. I'm actually kind of surprised the books have it up, to be honest, because there is so much up in the air. I think I pretty much agree with actually everything you walked through of them being a touch over based on last season and that bumping down to right around even if they lose Harden. But I do think, like we talked about, I think Embiid does play fewer games this season, and there is the very distinct possibility of a full blow up that, suddenly you're holding over 49 and a half wins and they win, 31 because, and Harden and Embiid are gone. So to me, that's not the most appealing way to play this. I think there are more appealing ways, and I probably am a stay away in this market for now.
Yeah, so I think what are the pathways to an under here? The pathways to an under is they don't get good return for Harden. Certainly seems likely. Joel doesn't play as many games. That definitely seems like it's in play based off of he got the MVP. Now he needs to focus on the championship, right? He's been hurt every single postseason. And nobody else pops, right? The ways that this goes over. Embiid plays 66 plus. Maxey jumps into superstar status. Nurse is that big of an upgrade over Doc.
Well, and I'll say this too. I mean, Harden had a great season last year. Even by the advanced metrics, by the on-off and all that. But they did have a pretty good replacement in DeAnthony Melton when they needed to move Maxey to kind of the lead, facilitator, and Melton next to him. I really like that five. It was only 90 minutes, but the dream starting five that they had last year of Harden, Maxey, Tucker, Embiid, and Harris. That had a net rating of plus 11.9. If you swap out Harden and throw in Melton, it was actually better. It was plus 17.6. Now, it was only 90 minutes. I am not here to say that that's a better starting five overall, certainly not in the postseason. But that's a really viable starting five. I do think the upgrade from Doc to Nurse, especially in the regular seasons, is going to be noticeable. My only worry is that they would somehow talk themselves into starting Pat Bev instead of DeAnthony Melton. Don't love that because Melton is great off the bench as well. So again, this is the land of unknowns right now. There are so many different ways this could go. But to speak to your point, there are paths to an under, but I think there are paths to an over as well. Embiid, maybe Embiid is just going to go regular season and doesn't mind being hurt in the postseason, and he wants to get another MVP. So he plays his 66 games, and they start Melton, and the team stays relatively healthy, and Harris. Quietly had a pretty strong season last year. That's a team that should win 50 games in the East. Pardon me. So I think there are paths both ways that are pretty distinct and possible, which is why overall my biggest takeaway is still that this is not the market for me.
Okay, so let's talk about what is and what are the markets for you. Give me some of the bets that you think have real value when we look at the carnage that lies in Philadelphia right now.
Absolutely. I think the most fascinating to me, I looked at this first and foremost from a player perspective. So pardon me here as I just rattle off some numbers. So hopefully this won't bore the listeners too much, but these are, I thought, some pretty interesting numbers. So these are from PPP Stats. Great site, has WNBA stuff too, if you're trying to look on there. So usage with or without Harden. So Maxey with Harden on the court, 19.0. With him off the court, 30.1. Embiid, there's not really any change. It goes up about 1.5, from 37.4 to 38.9. Points, though, Maxey, 24.9 to 36.5. Embiid, again, about the same. This one may be the most interesting. Assists per 100 possessions, Maxey 2.8 to 8.1. Embiid 4.9 to 8.1. So both of those guys see very notable jumps in playmaking roles with Harden off the court. Makes perfect sense. Now, the downside to that is both those players see drop in their effective field goal percentages to right around league average for both. So you are sacrificing efficiency, but you are getting huge increases for Maxey. And in terms of playmaking, Embiid is picking up the slack as well. So I think there's a lot to go off of there. So from a day-to-day angle, I think especially to start the season, I would be looking at Maxey and Embiid in assist market. That like the points one is the obvious one. They're going to know that that's there. They're going to adjust. The assist I think is an angle that's maybe you'll be able to find a little bit of an edge there to start the season, especially with Embiid, because again that's not a like for like. You don't necessarily think of Harden off the court, Embiid more of a playmaker, but that's something we saw last season. From a zoomed out futures perspective, and I think my favorite bet overall on this podcast is Tyrese Maxey, most improved player, plus 1,500. You mentioned it at the start of the pod. His numbers, the games that Harden was out last year, there are 13 games in which he played and Harden did not. He averaged 25 points, 5.5 assists. That was up from 20 and 3.5 overall. Got about 2 more minutes of playing time. I think that could increase even more. There were a couple of weird games there where he had limited minutes. And he got better and better as the season went along without Harden. He kind of grew into that facilitator role. He's really primed in that, kind of that age range, that experience, and those numbers that we've seen people in that kind of range really make that leap and win that award in seasons past. So that is the one that's really popping me. But I think we got to keep our eyes on a lot of things if this does go down, especially to start the season and kind of the player prop market as well.
All right, so let's talk through that a little bit. The most improved player has been an all-star level player the last couple of seasons. That's been like one of our ways of signaling the most improved player is when those ballots come out and anybody that like pops on that, or when the reserves are announced, those are good bets to make. Do you see a scenario where Tyrese Maxey makes a jump to all-star next season?
I do actually. I think especially in the East backcourt is always has room for individuals looking to make that leap. So I think I referenced 25 points and 5.5 assists in the games without Harden. I also mentioned that there were a couple of weird games in there where he didn't get as many minutes. I think that's kind of like not the floor. There's obviously a lower floor if he's got bad shooting luck or regresses a little bit. But I think that's a reasonable floor to expect from him if Harden goes out of town, but the rest of this team, is pretty much the same, and he's able to take more of that role. I think you could even see something like 27-6, and if that's what he's going to from 20 and 3.5, I think that absolutely puts him in the All-Star game. I think it puts him as probably a lead contender for most improved player.
Then here's the other one. Let's say the worst case scenario happens and Harden goes and then Embiid asks out and Embiid's gone too. Do they win enough games for Tyrese Maxey to be most improved player?
Well, and this is where I wonder if I can quickly stall for time and bring up Brandon Anderson's research on most improved player, because I know he has looked into this and he has figured out whether or not that matters in the grand scheme of things. So as I search for a second, do you want to give your thoughts and I'll see if I can figure out what he said?
Yeah, so I think when we look at kind of like the recent history of these types of things and the most improved player award, and we go back to Brandon Ingram, right? So Brandon Ingram, that team was actually pretty good when he won. Remember, they made the playoffs, but thanks to the bubble play-in tournament, the Pelicans were within range there. You've got Julius Randle, 2021. The Knicks make the playoffs. John Morant, 2022. The Grizzlies are a top 3 seed. Lauri Markkanen is the exception here. Now, Lauri didn't make the playoffs last year in part because Utah turned around and went the other fucking way. Like, they were just like, nope, we're out. Hard pass for us in the playoffs. But if they'd kind of gone for it, they likely probably make it. 2018, the Pacers, Indiana, again, playoff team. Siakam, 2019, same kind of deal. 2017, Bucks, on and on and on. These are mostly playoff teams that they've been a part of. At the same time, like, if Maxey comes out and is just like an explosive scorer, the big key here is going to have to be he's going to have to put up big numbers efficiently. But I will say that you have to. One of the things that this is awarded is kind of shifted from is it's less of a statistical profile. There are statistical profiles we've kind of found and talked about on how to bet MIP, and we'll do that episode here in a couple of weeks. But I do kind of wonder if you have to have like you have to get noticed. And if Embiid's gone, will anybody notice the Sixers enough for Maxey to be able to garner enough attention to win the award?
Well, and so you kind of walked through it, but you were 100% right. So the exact number was that before last season, 9 of the previous 10 winners of Most Improved Player had been in the postseason. So it has historically mattered, but we are also coming off a season in which we saw it not matter. So it definitely can be done, but I think it's probably something. It's a very good question to ask. And without either of them there, I don't see that as a playoff team. First of all, but I do think it could be in an annoying team to play because, like I said before, Harris had a pretty solid season last year. I think this, especially under Nick Nurse, a team that would run around and put up some nice numbers. So I think Maxey could at least be in the conversation. And then when you're in a big market like a Philadelphia that gets probably a little bit more. I'm a Knicks fan. I'm not throwing a stone in a glass house. It gets more coverage than it should, to be honest. Those players do kind of sneak their way into the conversation. And Maxey has been kind of a darling for that market in general. I think he's really well liked in the city, and so with a prominent presence in sports media, that he's not going to get overlooked as much as someone doing the same in maybe a smaller market in a smaller city. So I think that it's worth thinking about if the full teardown happens, if they're going to win enough. But I don't think he'd fully go under the radar. I think he probably would at least be on folks' radar enough to be in the conversation, and then whether or not they were winning enough would probably be the determining factor.
I'm going to be very mad if I was a year too early on Tyrese Maxey. I'm going to be very mad on that. Let's talk about the other direction here, because it's interesting to me. And that is odds to make the playoffs. To miss the playoffs entirely, plus 790, almost 8-1. This is obviously this is a flat out Embiid gets traded bet. Now, again, I need to stress this. I am not sitting here being it's a gold mine out there. Embiid's definitely gone. Again, the most likely outcome is that Joel Embiid plays the rest of the season with the Philadelphia 76ers. They are a 45 plus win team. They make the playoffs, etc. That's the most likely outcome. However, to me, there is a big enough question here about what happens if Harden's gone. There is no way from where I'm at that this ends with I'll back that up. It is hard for me to see the board here. When Morey had the Simmons situation, I am still extremely mad at myself for not seeing the Harden move. I know various actors in that situation well enough. I should have anticipated that to be of course he's going to wait and trade Ben Simmons for James Harden. Of course. And I was blinded by why would Harden leave the Nets? That should have taken me about 2 seconds to be oh, because Kyrie Irving's a dip. So that should have been easy to see that plan out there. And it's entirely possible that there's a long-term vision that I'm missing. And maybe it's Dame, maybe it's something else that's just oh no, obviously he's going to hold on to Harden and then trade him for this. I can't see it. And Harden clearly has intentions not to wait that long and to make this so miserable. I didn't kind of mention this at the forefront. Let's be really clear on what Harden's intentions were with his comments over the weekend. He's not talking to Daryl Morey. That Daryl Morey's a liar and I will not play for this. Daryl knows how he feels. They've talked. They know how he is very aware of the situation. That's a shot to ownership. That is trying to get ownership to be this is embarrassing. I want it over with. Trade him so we can move on. And if that doesn't work, it's a shot to the NBA to get Adam Silver to call and be can you guys go 6 months without being a goddamn clown show? And force the NBA to be you need to get this solved. It's an embarrassment for us. Solve it. And that's the objective from Harden's perspective. So I can't see it. And if there's no star coming back, then Embiid's going to be we got that guy? Awesome. Let's go. I think it's only natural to ask what Embiid's next move is. And so if Embiid's gone, obviously 790 is that's a dream number, right? And so I haven't bet it, but I'm trying to understand how much of is this worth a shot because of the value this will have. And a lot of this is trying to figure out how likely do you think it is that Embiid is gone? And that I think is an impossible number to try and figure out, which is probably why it's not a good bet. But if you are of the opinion that you're just like, yes, there is a cascading effect here, it's a domino effect. Harden's gone for no quality return, and Embiid asks out, and that's the next move. Then Sixers to miss the playoffs is the obvious bet here at 790.
Well, and you said this is a bet on Embiid leaving town, but it can be a bet on a little bit more than that. I think it can be a bet on a serious Embiid injury. We never I again I love Embiid. I'm not trying to talk this into existence. In fact, the opposite. I want to see a full healthy season from him. But I mean, he has a lengthy injury history. It's also a bet on Embiid being hurt just enough to make things interesting. And the East is a little bit deeper this season. I mean, it's not all that hard to picture 6 teams being better than the 76ers in the East if he misses, a good chunk of time. You got Celtics, Bucks, Heat, Cavs, Hawks. I think this Hawks team is going to be a little more interesting this season, and Knicks. So say Embiid misses, 30 games instead of his 15 games. Say they don't get the superstar that we think they're going to get back for Harden. And so those games he misses are a little harder to float. If they're around that 45, 46 range, it's not at all hard to imagine them being in the 7 seed. Then we've seen all sorts of craziness happen in those play-in games. It could be an injury. It could be just you lay an egg that a couple nights in a row. That there are paths to this missing the playoffs, I think, more than just trading Embiid away from town, which is why I don't think it's a hammer. I don't think it's like go, mortgage your house and put it on Sixers miss the playoffs plus 790. But I think at this number, I think it's worth a sprinkle right now.
So here's an idea to kind of put this through. We don't have exact seeding over-unders out in the market yet, but I was looking at a book, and what it had was Sixers are plus 500 to be the 1 seed, plus 500 to be the 2 seed, plus 500 to be a 3 seed, and then and plus 500 to be the 4 seed. So the odds are the same for 1 through 4 at 5 to 1. I need Brandon to be my math guy here.
I was actually literally pulling it up right now to see what we were getting.
Yeah. At 5th, we go to plus 550. At 6th, we go to 700. Okay. So we've got a drop off after the top 4. So that kind of like leads you to a very baseline level of belief that like, okay, the over under for conference seeding could be 4.5 for the Sixers, which would make a lot of sense here, right? We can also do that just by win total and look at, who are the win totals in terms of like who has the highest win numbers in the East versus the West. Celtics are 53.5. Cavaliers are the same as the Sixers at 49.5. Heat are below at 48.5. That will move up if they get Dame. They'll go to 50.5. I think. And so it's right in there in the 3-4 range for the Sixers. My point here is that you could probably put this together you could hedge with over 4.5 if Embiid stays, or under 4.5 if Embiid stays. So they finish top 4 and then bet them to miss the playoffs. You're missing out on 5 and 6 there. Brandon would probably say that this isn't good value because of the possibility of them landing 5 or 6, and God knows that'd be horrific. But I am just kind of interested in the idea of playing both ways on this, of being like, if Embiid's there, the market probably isn't right of how good they're still going to be. And if Embiid's gone, we have this value now on the prospect of him not being there.
Well, and I think they're an incredibly high variant team at this point. So I think that trying to catch them coming and going isn't the worst idea. I probably would look to do it slightly different maybe than in that seed one, just because I feel like the ceiling is still there for them to be a top 2 seed. I almost would do, top 2 seed or miss the playoffs and just cut out a little bit of that, extra middle, because I do think that, if this team has the season that we're kind of expecting, but things don't go right, they're going to be right there at the top of the East. So I think their ceiling is there. Is there any world in which, I know Dame has said he's only going to Miami, is there any world in which we get him to Philadelphia? Because then I would even, if that's a possibility, to me that's intriguing enough for a title conversation, because I think those two pair so well that raises the ceiling of this team. And if I'm baking in an Embiid, I'm gonna try to be healthy for the postseason moment. To me, that's an intriguing option as well.
I bet it that already in the early days of the Dame saga. So I can't sit here and be like it's a bad bet because that's one I've already made. Um, I think the problem is I think that if that was a possibility, then it would have already happened because quite
Yeah,
honestly, it would have been here's what it would have happened. Dame would have been like, I want Miami or Philly. And Philly would have been like, wait, this gets us out of our problem. So we'll give up some assets. We'll trade Tobias Harris. We'll trade, they won't give up Maxi, but like we'll trade D'Anthony Melton. We'll trade Paul Reed. We'll move these other guys in a sign and trade. It would be like we'll move these other guys to make this happen because that covers it stops the apocalypse from happening, which is what they're facing right now.
yeah, I tend to agree on that, and I think that it's why the ceiling of this team is intriguing. But to me, with the extremes being high priced on either end, the floor of this, the bottom falling out of this, is more intriguing to me as a better than the extreme ceiling.
I think it's a good way to put it. Any last second bets you want to talk about before we get out of here?
No, I think the most improved player for Maxi is one that I really like, and then I think I will be at least sprinkling a little bit on that Sixers to miss the playoffs as well.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for Buckets on a Tuesday. My thanks to Jim Turvey for joining us. You can catch him on Twitter and in the Action Network app at Turvey Bets. Make sure to check it out for both WNBA, and you can catch that podcast over here, the Wuckets podcast, and as well as catch all of his plays across the betting universe. We'll be back on Thursday. I'll be back with an episode probably talking about the Elite 100 list, which I'm hopeful to get out this week. That'll be very exciting. Make sure to tune in for that. Next week, we start our full program of off-season how to bet guides. We're going to start with totals and sides. Good stuff coming to you on NBA betting here on Buckets. My thanks to David Payne, our audio producer. My thanks to all the great crew over on the video side for making this video and my dashing mug worth looking at over on YouTube. My thanks to Matt Mitchell, our coordinating podcast producer. We'll be back next week later this week with another episode. Till then, let's get buckets.